Welcome to the Me, You and Data podcast, the podcast that uncovers insights from leading data science and analytics professionals globally to enable you to grow your career, teams and business. I'm Joseph Carla, your host and founder at 633 who bring you this podcast. We hope you get value from this episode. Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Me, You and Data podcast. And today I'm delighted to have a wonderful guest. I'm really happy that we managed to get her. It is Caroline Zimmerman. She's the Data Products and Strategy Director at Profusion. You know, as we always do, Caroline, do you mind just introducing yourself a bit more for the audience?
Sure. So you mentioned already, I'm Director of Data Products and Strategy at Profusion, which is a data consultancy. And we do, the whole gamut really from data science and data engineering to data strategy and data product work. And I've been here about 2.5 years. And then before that, I started and led the data function at a global music company called BMG. And before that, I did an MBA, which is really where I discovered data because I was a literary agent before that, working in book publishing. So yeah. Definitely squiggly.
Yes, no, very squiggly. And I'm looking forward to really getting into the nuts and bolts of your career as well. But the meat of this podcast, I guess, is data and getting value from data and really data strategy and speaking essentially all things data and getting value from data. So I guess before we start, what value means is vastly different for different people, different stakeholders. How would you define value? And how should people kind of think about defining value, as it relates to that definition?
Somebody actually made a comment on a LinkedIn post that I did today where he was like, essentially value has become an empty buzzword because that's what everyone's like obsessed with in the data world at the moment, especially with budgets getting slashed, and data teams having to justify their existence more than ever before. And so everyone's been talking about value, and what do we mean? And it means, revenue increase and profit increase and increasing efficiencies and reducing costs and reducing risks. And I've been grappling myself with this question of what do we really mean by value? And, I was mentioning this to you before, I've actually started studying it.
Yeah.
And we've been doing more work with private equity firms. And, for anyone who may not be familiar, private equity firms make an investment in a portfolio company, increase the value, hopefully, of that company over the course of basically 5 years and then sell it usually for more than they bought it, right? That's the point. And I find that their perspective on what it means to increase value with data is super interesting because what it means is I sold the company for more than I bought it for in a 5-year time horizon. And so I think that because they have such a super specific definition of value, it's increasing enterprise value over a specific time horizon, just have a really interesting perspective to offer everyone else that has a lot more of a vague definition of value.
Yeah. It's very tangible.
It is really tangible. And, what I've discovered so far, we're still at the early stages of the research, but what I can say is that actually there's 3 layers to the value creation.
Okay.
The first layer is have I quantified, there's going to be a strong growth hypothesis, right? Which is why a private equity firm would make an investment in a portfolio company to begin with. It's because they believe in the growth plan. Yeah. But that's not always quantified. And that doesn't always have KPIs and metrics associated with it, right? And so the first stage of value creation is going to be around quantifying that growth model, which is different than traditional BI. It's not just some KPIs, right? It's very specifically what needs to be true about our business for us to grow by this much in this amount of time. Yeah. And so what often that will look like is some form of KPI tree or customer journey mapping or something like that to understand where fall off points are. And, really what that means is it's giving you control over your business. It's allowing really the board and the exec team to really understand what is driving growth and where the levers of control are to be able to get the business back on track if it's falling off of its planned course. Yeah. So that's layer 1, probably interestingly the most important one.
Yeah.
And then the second one is revenue optimization.
Okay.
And so that's going to be where most of your data science models come in. So for more like consumer facing businesses, it's going to be like propensity and upsell, cross-sell models and churn models and, ways to optimize the customer journey to make sure you're moving people along that customer journey. Yeah. Then in more like manufacturing, it'll be things more like predictive maintenance or workforce planning, utilization, things like that. And so it just kind of depends on the business line, a lot around pricing analytics, marketing attribution models. So like data science and econometrics.
Yeah.
And then the last one is much more rare, but does exist, which is when you're not just trying to touch EBITDA, so profit, but the EBITDA multiple, right? Because a valuation is going to be EBITDA
based on that
times multiple.
Yeah.
And in order to change the multiple, it means you're just totally changing the competitive positioning of the company within its industry, or you're just making it look like you've changed industries entirely, right? Yeah. And all of a sudden, instead of being worth 2 times EBITDA, it's going to be worth 5 times EBITDA. But usually that's going to be a big digital innovation, and data will be a component to that. But data is only really ever going to enable that kind of function. It's not going to be like a data thing only.
Yeah.
So those are the layers. And I have found that to be, it's really helping, like this research is really helping me clarify my thinking.
Your understanding of like what value
around
actually looks
like.
Yeah.
And I think that such a big part of it is, have you been able to quantify that growth hypothesis? And if you don't have a strong growth hypothesis, how can you use data to create a strong growth hypothesis?
Yeah. That's a really deep understanding of value. And I think what I really take from that is that it's really driven by a lot of revenue factors, right? It's quite financial in its approach, which allows it to be very kind of singular in its motivation almost as it relates to kind of what value is. What happens when people or when companies perhaps don't have a well-defined definition of value? And I'm sure through your experience, you've seen more than a couple of car crashes of projects or engagements where value isn't defined effectively at the start. What are some things that kind of could happen if people get that initial definition wrong and aren't on the same page with that?
Yeah, it's funny. I was just having a LinkedIn conversation about this morning. So where I've seen it go off track the most is when the technical or data, the technical team has a different definition of what value means compared to stakeholders.
Oh, okay.
And so way back in Profusion's history, when we were first making our forays into data, we were originally a CRM company. And then I think 8 years ago is when we started becoming more of a, we started changing tags. And so working for an airline, I believe at the time, our lead data scientist created this totally brilliant churn model that was extremely accurate at predicting customer churn.
Yeah.
But then the main stakeholder's definition of success and value was certainly not predicting churn with accuracy. It was being able to retain customers effectively.
Oh, wow.
And that was where the ball dropped in a way, was, our early foray into what we think delivering value is versus what the stakeholder thinks. And I guess it's just all about making sure that everyone is on the same page, and that also the value is always a business benefit rather than like a data thing.
Yeah.
And I think of that sort of as product thinking in a way, right? That like the solution and the value that you're delivering should be solving a customer problem, whether that's an external, like one of your customers, or as a data team serving an internal customer. So someone who's head of marketing, for example. I think that is very much what the product approach is like, is make sure that you're delivering a quantifiable business benefit to an end user rather than this model works really well.
Yeah. And you do see sometimes kind of like data science teams, they produce fantastic work where in other situations, it would be very helpful, but actually because it's not on the same page as the main stakeholder and their definition of value, actually it ends up being a waste of time and a bit of a cost center.
Yeah.
So I guess, so we have our definition of kind of value and those 3 factors and it being linked to, I guess, financial gains in some capacity.
Can I just also interrupt? I think what's interesting about private equity is the hypothesis in many private equity firms is that being able to track that growth hypothesis leads to a higher valuation, right? Because what it means is you're able to demonstrate control of your own business better, and your exit narrative is going to be stronger. Yeah. What I would say is that most companies aren't trying to exit, so they don't have that. Yeah. They're not able to track it to company valuation maybe in the same way. Yeah. But definitely what it's helped me think about is it's not just about the ROI of a single data initiative. It's also about increasing the value of a company as a whole.
Whole business, yeah.
Okay. And in that way, because I think we've been moving away from thinking, we have to prove the ROI of every single data initiative. And while I think having rigor and discipline around that is important, data is ultimately an enabling function. And it's okay for it to be an enabling function. So just to say that is probably harder to quantify for other businesses who don't have a 5-year investment horizon,
going towards exit and stuff. But like you mentioned, having that discipline around their data initiatives is still important, right?
Yes,
because, when you kind of look at, okay, this data initiative that I'm doing, what's the benefit? Like, how is this going to benefit the business as a whole? You tend to make perhaps different decisions, like go down different roads with kind of the type of work that you're doing, but also bring different people in, right? Because if it's going to benefit the whole business, guess what? The whole business have to know what you're doing, and like you have to collaborate in some way as well. So I think, that's really important, and it's good to kind of bring that lens of how private equity firms view it, because I guess there's a lot of benefit that other people can take from that as well. So, now that we have kind of, a robust definition of value for organizations who have a lot of untapped data, right, and have an abundant stream of data that they're just not using, how do these organizations kind of go about getting actual value from the data?
So me 2 years ago, or even a year ago, would have said, start with the business strategy and then think about, what you're trying to achieve as a business, and what sorts of questions could you ask of your data that would help you meet those business objectives. And I think that I've really shifted my thinking on that more recently, because what I've noticed is that a lot of companies, I think, in a way, struggle to articulate that business strategy. And I think that the role of data is also in helping to articulate the growth hypothesis, right? So in a private equity scenario, if they're making an investment, it's because the company probably already has a strong growth hypothesis. Yeah. A lot of quote unquote regular companies that aren't actively looking for investment don't necessarily have that. And I think that that's what makes a compelling business strategy, is having a growth hypothesis. And I think that the best way to go about doing that is mapping out your customer journey. And finding out where people are dropping off, finding out, and you might have 5 journeys or 10 journeys for like quite different personas, especially if it's like an omni-channel retail, context, for example. So it's not necessarily one singular customer journey, right? But, in general, do you understand how your customers are moving through your funnel and where your drop-off points are? And are you able to track how that changes over time and use that map to understand and start to articulate ideas for how you could move, how you can increase conversion, how you can increase the acquisition of high-value customers or prospects, and then how you can increase their conversion. And that's the place to then go start digging for your data. It's certainly not to start with the data, but I think that sometimes it's not even necessarily to start with the business strategy. It's really to start with the customer journey and then work your way back into that to understand, again, just those key drop-off points and where it would be most valuable to increase effort to get people to move through a certain stage by targeting it at certain personas or whatever it is. But so I'd say start with the customer journey.
Okay, yeah. And you mentioned that your answer 2 years ago would have been different. What kind of made the switch for you to kind of think about customer journey on the front end? Because I haven't really heard it from too many people as it relates to kind of thinking about business strategy. What kind of caused that shift for you?
I think because what I found just working with different organizations is that many business strategies are quite not finger in the air, but not necessarily data informed.
Yes. Okay.
And they're more like, okay, we think that we can increase sales. And often I think business strategies are more just around goals for different product categories or different regions, rather than just like a data informed, okay, we can see that these 3 fall off areas in our journey are significant. And therefore, we're going to develop these 3 hypotheses for each one of these journey stages to try and retain people or move them through our funnel better. And that can then become a big informing part to your business strategy, for it to become more data informed. Whereas, I think before I just assumed, most companies have a perfect business strategy. And from that, you can backtrack into what data should be doing to support that. But then realizing that often that's not necessarily the case, and that actually the data team fundamentally can help with that and support with that. Like defining the business strategy to begin with based on what you see in the data. So it's starting at a different point and using that information to then inform your business strategy. And often there will be really good instincts already in the commercial business strategy, but it's a way to just really enrich that picture. And I guess be a sparring partner to the commercial leaders instead of just an order taker. In a way, and to just be part of that strategic conversation about where the company should be moving and where the opportunities for growth are. I love that. Be a sparring partner rather than an order taker, and you're being a sparring partner with the information that the data gives you. So that's fantastic. A few years ago, I did a study with my old professor of decision sciences from business school at MYAD. He's also the person I'm pairing up on the PE research with.
Nice.
And one of the people that we interviewed was the chief data officer at a major news organization. And he was really interesting because he did have a seat on the ExCo. And what he was saying, he had a really brilliant career at this organization. What he was saying is, I understood the way the business worked under the hood better than anybody else. And I think if you can say that as a chief data officer, you've won. Like that's it, is to understand how the levers of growth work. Again, to bring it back to that PE the private equity research finding around being able to articulate and measure, I guess, track performance against the growth hypothesis. It means you understand how the business makes money. Under the hood, you understand at a really, really granular level what things you can shift and, the levers at your disposal. And he was a chief data officer who understood that. And I think in some ways few do. I think that's really changing as there's been a lot more emphasis on CDOs or data leaders who are business value focused rather than technical capability focused. But I think he was an early pioneer in that.
And, a lot of what you've mentioned, I find that communication and communication style is important to kind of making those goals happen, right? So this CDO who was on the ExCo, what type of skills did he have to be able to influence decision making? And I think you wrote a post really kind of advocating, I guess, for that consultative skill set, persuasion. And I think that's actually where we first really connected, because I do a lot of work with consulting firms, at the senior level, and I see that skill set being such an enabler in the boardroom for data professionals. But data professionals perhaps don't focus on it as much, or it isn't spoken about as much. So seeing you kind of really advocate for that. So do you mind kind of speaking to how, a consultative and kind of that influence and persuasion can actually really help to get things done from a data perspective as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's also I have some battle scars from not necessarily having had that skill set when I was in my previous data leadership role. And I didn't understand how the business worked under the hood. And I was much more in that order taker. Like, I guess I assumed at the time that the business could tell me what to do, like tell me their requirements, and I could go off and build those things. And I and my team would be successful. And it turns out that you can build things to exact requirements and still be unsuccessful.
Which is quite frustrating as well, I'm assuming.
But I think that's where the consultative skill set really comes in and has the power to really transform it, from like an order taker type of relationship into that consultative business partner, relationship of equals in a way kind of thing. And I think there's a few things. So I've been at Profusion for over 2.5 years. And first of all, I think that with consulting, one of the habits, I report to the chief commercial officer.
Yeah.
And one of the habits that she's really ingrained in me is put yourself in your customer's shoes. And I didn't used to do that. It's about making that habitual, right? Like thinking about whether it's a customer. So in the case of Profusion, like a paying customer, or whether it's just an internal customer of a data leader. Yeah. It's just really understanding things from their perspective. What's on their mind? What's the influence map? Just understanding like what the stakeholder wants for their own career and how you can enable their career journey. Yeah. Just as much as what the organization's goals might be, just reflexively thinking about things from trying to imagine what it would be like to be in your stakeholder's shoes and what they would care about, and crafting the message according to that understanding. I think it really helps because there's just a much higher standard when people are paying customers than when they're your internal customers, and rightfully so, right? Like if you're paying for a thing, it needs to be really, really good. And I think it's just taken my work to a higher standard of delivery. And I think people who have that kind of consulting background, again, it's ingrained. So even if you go back to be in-house, that just remains, like that delivery quality remains. And like good PowerPoint is actually powerful. Yeah. It's not just tell stories with data, but executive ready stories.
What do you mean by that, executive ready stories? I think I know, but do you mind just expanding on that?
I guess there's a difference between, you're preparing something for a marketing manager to be able, like, I don't know, say you're doing a project on personalizing CRM communications or email communications, for example, right? The way that you would present that to the marketing manager who simply needs to, in a way, act on that. Like say you've done a churn algorithm and then you just need to plan the campaigns to see how you're going to retain people, and you're going to run some A/B tests and like see what incentives are the most powerful to get people to keep coming back. That's very different than if you are preparing or like helping that marketing executive prepare for the next budget presentation to the board so that you can help them unlock budget so that you can carry on doing even more sophisticated personalization pieces. And I think, again, it's just being mindful of who the audience is. Yeah. So is the PowerPoint that I'm preparing for someone who just needs to action this information operationally, or do I need to sell this somehow? Or do I need to help my stakeholder sell this somehow? And I think you don't get away with not delivering business benefit in consulting. And so you're just not going to get renewed. Like if you are not delivering a sense of tangible value to the client, that's over. Yeah. No, and so again, I think it's just like keeping people to that standard of delivery. Yeah, no, that's good. And, one thing I wanted to ask you about as well, especially given your role with Profusion, is kind of there's organizations who have, started new revenue streams from their untapped data, or kind of built different data products and monetized that. How have you seen that play out? And I guess how can organizations who perhaps aren't as in tune with data product and monetization, how can they kind of get on board with it from a standing start almost? Yeah, I mean, I don't have any experience myself on monetizing. So like my data product role is more data as a product. So for example, it would be more like instead of having a propensity model just sitting in a spreadsheet, it would be how do you build it into a user interface in Salesforce for a salesperson to be able to action that information as like a prioritized to-do list of people to call, right? So that's the kind of data product work that I do. The kind of data product work that is more around how do you package up a data feed to make it consumable by an end user, I don't really have direct experience in. Yeah. I mean, I guess what I have seen from the people that I know who do work in data product companies where what they are selling is data is that you can make a lot of money by collecting information by calling people, putting it into structured formats, and then selling that on. Especially for organizations, I guess sort of in the financial sector, who are interested in information advantages. Yeah. to be able, and like I've seen this, right? I think it just depends on, do you have information that people are willing to pay for that is unique? And a big way to do that is like manually collecting information into data feeds that can then be packaged and passed on and sold. And I've seen companies do that really successfully.
Yeah.
So that's my 2 cents on that.
No, like makes sense. And like, I guess as we switch gears into like, you know, the last half of the podcast, if you will, I always like to put the spotlight on you in terms of from a career standpoint, right? So I was really interested in speaking with you, Caroline, because like you mentioned at the start, you've had that squiggly career where you've kind of come from a bit of a non-technical background into kind of like, you know, like overseeing the data in a very senior role. Do you mind just speaking to that? Because there's a lot of people who I speak to who are trying to get training in data or trying to transition into a kind of more data career. How was that for you? And I guess, like what are some pieces of advice that you can give to others?
So I studied English Lit and thought that I never wanted to touch math, numbers, or technology ever again. And I was really relieved that I just never had to open up a science textbook after finishing, high school. Yeah. And I think I realized, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years into my book publishing career, where as a literary agent, that the one thing I cared about more than books was women in leadership. That was what I cared about at the time. And like book publishing has a lot of very senior women in it. It didn't feel like opening doors there was, it just didn't feel like a door opening or like cutting edge thing, Yeah. So it's like, okay, well, if that's what I care about, I'd better overcome my fear of math and technology, which I think has a gender aspect to it. Better overcome my fear of math and technology. I'm going to go get an MBA and I want to be on the business side of media. That was like what I was aiming for. Yeah. And I think over time, I've become maybe a bit less interested in women in leadership and more interested in how human beings can be their authentic selves at work and still succeed in their careers.
Yeah, okay.
And in business school, I took some classes, like it was a big data electives of some kind. Anyway, with the professor that I've done this research with, very life-changing professor for me. And I just became super interested in it. And after business school, so I did all of any elective that was like big data or stats I took. And I worked with that professor over my summer internship, essentially, to go and do a data project with a media company. Yep. And that was kind of the way that I shifted, was I stayed in media. So just after business school, I got a job at Bertelsmann, which is the big German media group. And they ran a program at the time called the Bertelsmann Entrepreneurs Program, where you were allowed to do whatever you wanted for 18 months. It was absolutely brilliant. So it was 3 to 6 month short projects, and you could do it on whatever you wanted. And so I did all of mine in data, and I self-taught, I did Coursera's data science specialization. It was 10 course. It was 8R programming, essentially. Learned SQL and Tableau also in that 18-month period. And that was like, I don't know, my retraining, I guess. And because there was a media aspect, all my book publishing background and the storytelling and the like how you craft stories all just came together really nicely. And then at the end of my final project, which was at BMG, they said, why don't you come and start and lead our data team? Nice. So I don't know how replicable that is, but I do think what is replicable is if the big career shift feels impossible, what is the small shift that you can make in the right direction? So in business school, there were a lot of people who wanted to change career. They wanted to change function, they wanted to change industry, and they wanted to change geography. And what the career advice people used to say was, don't try and change more than 2. And I guess changing 1 is even more realistic than changing 2. Yeah. And I think that's also true. So like, for example, if you want to get into data, but you've been in a marketing role, how can you start doing like data-y things in your current marketing role? Just like, what is the incremental way to move in the direction? And I guess lucky breaks happen when you're moving in the direction. Like movement invites good luck, I think. For sure. Yeah. And so once you're moving in that direction, I think it opens up the space for a little bit of magic to happen. Yeah. And at some point, I do think you get big breaks, but your job is just to continue incrementally moving in the direction that you want to get to. Yeah. And then wait for the cool serendipitous things to happen, which sometimes take a couple years.
Take time.
But like just the consistent move in the incremental change direction, I've found to be miracle making for career transformations or like big career changes.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice. And I guess because there may be some people where the change or that big change takes a little bit longer to come, but actually because you're kind of going in the right trajectory, you should have some kind of confidence that it will eventually come. And also you're improving your skill set anyway during that time. And for you coming from a non-technical background, how was it for you to kind of get into the nuts and bolts of coding in R?
Yeah, it was really hard.
That for the first time.
It was super hard. It was super hard.
I'm not a maths person either, so I can't even imagine kind of like, really getting technical with things. So what was your mindset like going into that? And I guess what was that transition like from the hands-on piece, like getting to understand the data?
I guess the most important thing was the mindset shift, which was, wait a minute, maybe I'm not bad at math. Maybe I'm just afraid of math. And everyone is capable of being decent at math and technology. You might not be a genius, but honestly, you don't need to be a genius for this stuff. Good enough is good enough. And with that attitude, it allowed me to accept that I didn't need to be amazing. I just needed to get to average. And that felt really manageable. And that felt like, oh, well, I can do that. And then my value add is that I can come with all that humanities, like, I don't know, the people-y stuff and the,
like artsy.
But all I needed was to be average. And if I could just aim for that, I'd be okay. And I guess not having kids at the time was really important. Because now I have a child and it's much more difficult to do extracurricular stuff because I used to spend a lot of nights doing this stuff. And I could do that. I could stay till 10 or 11 at the office just tinkering with whatever I was trying to learn. So I think it was useful that I didn't have a ton of like responsibility to be able to do that. I find that now that I have a child, it's much more difficult to learn new technical skills extracurricularly. And I guess the other thing is it just was hard. And I guess I'd gotten a lot better at like knowing how to do nice things for myself to keep me going. Like, what are the things outside of that are going to fill me up, that are going to allow me to continue to have the courage to chip away at this thing that feels completely impossible. Because I literally did not know what a KPI was. When I started business school, I'd never done anything in Excel. I barely knew how to copy paste a cell. I'd never done a PowerPoint, like just so many of the basics I did not have. And I guess that was the other thing is I was like, well, I'm not going to bother learning Excel. Everyone and their mother knows Excel. That's not going to give me a competitive advantage. If I learn R, that is differentiating. And so I think it's also just thinking about, red oceans and blue oceans. For anyone who might not know, a red ocean is the idea of like a very competitive, really hard to stand out. A blue ocean is where you have a chance to just be different. And I guess that this is the other thing is, especially if you're a domain expert in something looking to retrain into data, that domain expertise is so precious. So the GMAT is the exam that you have to take to get into business school. And there's a verbal part and a math part. And you get a much better overall score if you're moderately good in both than if you're extremely good in one. And like not that great in the other. It's more powerful to be moderate in both. And I think that's kind of a cool life lesson. Like probably it's more value add for the company if you can be moderately good at data and moderately good at domain expertise rather than like no domain expertise, but amazing at data or zero. So I think there's something really powerful in being someone who combines skill sets because that makes you unique. You might not be the best in data. You might not be the best marketer or like whatever it is, right? You might not be the best, I don't know, automotive dealer. But you're the automotive dealer who learned data, who can teach an entire sales organization in an automotive company how to optimize their sales pipeline better than anyone else because that makes you super unique. And so I guess it's just like thinking about the particular combination of skills that allows you to stand out while being true to yourself.
Whilst being true. And because I have a lot of people approaching me, speaking to me about, trying to transition at varying levels of seniority, right? And one thing that they kind of always tend to dismiss is their domain expertise, right? They think that, okay, I just have to go and like spend my entire life learning everything about data and getting really highly skilled in that and kind of discount their domain expertise. But it's like you've got 10 years experience in...
That's so valuable.
Like I think that advice about kind of combining, like finding what combinations work for you to make you unique. That's fantastic. And you touch on a point there where, like, you know, we've spoken a lot about, you know, you obviously being a working mother. I'm a working dad. I've got 3 daughters. You've got 1. And I speak to a lot of people about this as well, right? It's like a common thing where most people have in common these days, but it isn't really spoken about as much externally. But how has it been for you kind of being a working parent, and how have you, I guess, been able to navigate that new dimension shift?
Yeah, I love that you called it a dimension shift, because
Yeah.
I think it is.
Yeah.
I think I didn't know how to continue having a career. Well, I just didn't know how to conduct. I felt like there was no space for me to dream anymore for a while in the beginning. You know, it just needed to be like, get through the day, especially when your kid is getting sick all the time, when their immune system is first developing, and then you're getting sick, and then your partner's getting sick.
Yeah.
And it just felt like we were in survival mode. And I think, first of all, that's fair. Like, I think that's something that I've learned to appreciate, is it is okay to be in survival mode and just be like getting through.
Yeah.
And I needed to give myself permission to just be in, and it was also COVID when that happened. And it was just like a lot together, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, we were talking about this before, but I think for me, the magic has been choosing to become an individual contributor again, and having an extremely supportive company that said, you know, basically that wasn't going to demote me for saying, I need a break from being a manager, from being on our leadership team. I just need to like play in a smaller pitch somehow and just be an expert. Yeah. And yes, like provide thought leadership to our teams and lead our project teams. But as we were saying, like just take a break from that pastoral care kind of aspect, because I felt I was doing so much pastoral care in my parenting journey. And I just didn't have that much energy left over to care deeply in the way that I want to care when I'm a manager. Yeah. And I think it's been incredibly powerful to have a company that supports me in that. I think Profusion, you know, we're a small company. Yeah. We're not that big. We're 50, 60 people. And for a company of our size, I think we just provide so much support and flexibility to working parents. And that has really allowed me to and I'm having the best time. Like, I've not felt this much joy and just passion about my work and feeling like I'm doing exciting things since I became a working parent as now. Nice. And I think that moving down to 4 days a week and just being that individual contributor where I get to be an expert instead of a manager has just been really key in making me feel like there's like really exciting things for me ahead in my career. And like I can imagine it and I can work towards it again, and I can get excited about stuff instead of just being like, all I can think about is the next 24-hour period and like how I'm going to get through it.
No, that's and sometimes you do have to give yourself that grace to be in survival mode, as you mentioned. I think that's an important piece, because it's a phase, right? To an extent, like, you know, it's not going to be like that forever.
Nor that, of course, when it's happening to you for the first time.
You have no idea. You think that this is it. You think that this is it. And you know, that can be quite demoralizing, transparently, right? Because like you mentioned, it takes your ability away to kind of dream to an extent, like, okay, what's my career going to be like in 5 years? Like, how am I going to feel? Like, can I do this for another 3-4 years? But I think you've been really intentional as well about making those career changes to an extent where you're still able to add the same amount of value, if not more, in your kind of new role as well. And I think we've spoken about this, and I've spoken about it with like other people, but around that piece where there's organizations allowing individuals to be on a different career track that's more suited to them. An example could be a technical person who wants to remain technical as they kind of move up through the ranks of seniority and becomes a distinguished engineer, or associate partner who wants to remain on the technical side more than on the commercial side and becomes an expert partner, right? So, you know, it's really important that companies offer this, and actually that could be a route to allowing more females to be in leadership and in management as well, because it allows them to still kind of have a say whilst not kind of, you know, neglecting their other responsibilities in different phases of their life, like yourself, I guess. Yeah,
and I also guess, like, and this is why I've moved away from the sort of women in leadership conversations, because I think essentially the corporate world tends to reward, I don't know, pre-existing power structures that don't allow a lot of people to bring their whole selves to work. And I guess that's sort of the point, is how do you try and bring more of your whole self to work? And how do you find organizations that are going to support your whole self instead of you having to like hide away parts? I guess what I appreciate about Profusion is I get to be completely myself and not be looking over my shoulder about that. And I guess my wish is that everyone has the chance to find that at some point.
For sure. And like my advice for people trying to find that is, you know, because there's a lot of companies who will say that they offer that, or who would say, but you know, one thing I always say to people is, okay, you need to be able to see the tangible internal examples of where that's worked and how that's worked, right?
And also, what does the exec leadership team look like? Because that tells you a lot, right? If the whole exec leadership team of a company looks the same, if they're all cookie cutters, that means that if you look different, you're probably not ever going to make it there.
Or it's like, okay, if you are supposedly able to make it there, what's the evidence?
Well, what is the evidence? Seriously though, right?
There isn't really evidence, right? So like I think it's definitely important, and that piece of being able to be authentically yourself. Unfortunately, we are seeing a lot of companies, even companies that have historically been set in their ways. Like some of my clients, you know, are kind of large consulting organizations who have kind of really changed their internal makeup. And it's been quite interesting to see. And, you know, COVID, all the bad that happened with COVID, a lot of good came out of it as well, because it enabled organizations to see actually we can transform very quickly and quite dramatically as well in a short space of time. So that's really good. And one of the last questions that I wanted to ask you, that I ask all of my guests, is what's the best piece of career advice that you've had?
So my first boss was the co-founder of the literary agency that I worked at. And she's still one of like 2 or 3 people who, when I look at their life, I'm like, I want to be like you. You know, she had become a literary agent in her 50s, so came to it really late in her career, and had Pulitzer Prize winning authors, #1 New York Times bestselling authors. And she's passed away now. But you know, she passed away from cancer, but was still editing books at the age of 80 something, like in hospice, you know, and her authors coming to visit her. And she did everything with such grace and intelligence, but also joie de vivre and love. And I was maybe 1 year into working, 6 months into working for as an editorial assistant when I first started. It was my first job out of uni. And I was like freaking out about it. I don't know what. Am I going to be successful? And is it going to work out? And I'm going to, you know, imposter syndrome and all this stuff. And so I went hyperventilating into her office, and she and I used to have the most epic chats. So hyperventilating in her office, and she says, all right, Caroline, first of all, I want you to breathe. And next, I'm going to ask you the most important question, which is this: are you having any fun? And I think that's it. It's like, it's when I have had the most fun that I've had the most success. And following the fun and following that spark of like what feels almost like play more than work is where I've seen the magic happen the most.
That's great advice. Well, and just to stay on that point a little bit, because there may be individuals who, you know, they see something fun that they could do, or they felt something fun, but it's difficult for them to kind of make that transition over because they're kind of stuck in their ways, or it's kind of, they have a stable opportunity, or it's like difficult for them to step out. What kind of advice would you give for that person trying to, like, you know, actually go after that fun thing as a career, or that fun part of the job, to kind of hopefully experience more success?
I'm not sure, because I think we all have different tolerances for risk. So I think if you're someone who really, really, really needs stability above fun or creativity, I think it just depends on people's risk tolerance. And I guess mine is like maybe a little higher. Like I take my partner, for example, And we just have different risk profiles and different risk appetites. Like he's been with the same company since uni, right? And that has worked really great for him. And I think he's found his path in that way. He's taken a very different path than I have, basically. Mine has been super squiggly. His has been very straight. And I think both are totally valid.
Yeah, that's true,
So I'm not sure that I would just say for you what feels like your next right thing. And I do find that my intuition always guides me well. And like, you know, with Profusion, for example, I felt from the moment that I spoke. My first interview was with the head of data science, I think, and the director of HR. And instantly I just felt connected. And I was like, this is going to be it. This is what I've been looking for. Like this connection is the most important thing now for me.
Perfectly put. I think I would have loved to meet your first boss. Like she sounds like an amazing person.
Yeah, one of the greats.
Yeah, one of the greats. Definitely sounds like it. But look, Caroline, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. I really appreciate
Thank you so much for having me.
I encourage everyone to follow you on LinkedIn. You post some amazing stuff. But that's been it, guys. Another episode of the Me, You and Data podcast. Thank you so much for watching till the end of that episode. Hopefully you found value in that episode. And if you did, then don't forget to subscribe, follow, and also share this episode with others. And if you would like to know more about what we do here at 633, which is to help data professionals find work and help amazing organizations hire technical talent, so don't hesitate to get in touch.